The Archive of Forgotten Things. Elena Vance lived her life in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. At 26, she was a master of a dying art, book restoration. Her world was the basement of the Oak Haven Public Library, a place that smelled of cedar, vanilla, and the slow decay of centuries-old paper. She was a woman of shadows, always wearing high-collar blouses to conceal the jagged, silvery scar that ran from her collarbone to the nape of her neck. It was a physical reminder of a night 10 years ago when her childhood home had gone up in flames, taking her family's peace with it. She loved her work because books didn't demand anything from her. They didn't ask about her past or stare at her scars. When a spine was snapped or a page was foxed, Elena had the tools to make a whole again. She lived in a tiny studio apartment where the floorboards groaned, and her only indulgence was a single cup of expensive jasmine tea every Sunday. She was content being invisible. She believed that if she stayed quiet enough, the world's cruelty would forget she existed. She was a ghost tending to ghosts, meticulously gluing the past back together, while her own future remained a blank, dusty shelf. The peace of the archive was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon by the heavy thud of combat boots on linoleum. 3 men in tailored charcoal suits entered, their presence sucking the oxygen out of the small room. They looked like predators in a paper cage. The lead man, a mountain of a human named Marcus, placed a metal briefcase on Elena's workbench, narrowly missing a delicate 18th century map. "Elena Vance?" Marcus asked. His voice was like grinding stones. Elena nodded, her pulse hammering against the scar on her neck. "Our employer has a delicate matter. He was told you are the best, that you can fix what others throw away." He clicked the briefcase open. Inside was a child's sketchbook, but it looked like it had been through a paper shredder. The pages were confetti, stained with what looked like tears and grime. It was a total loss by any professional standard. I can't," Elena whispered, her hands trembling. "The fibers are too damaged. There's nothing to anchor the glue to." Marcus leaned in, his shadow eclipsing her. "Mr. Vane doesn't pay for can't. He pays for done. You have 10 minutes to pack your kit. There's a car waiting, and it's not the kind you keep waiting." The black glass fortress. The drive took Elena away from the familiar, crumbling brick of the city and into the secluded hills of the North Ridge. They pulled up to a monolithic structure of black glass and reinforced steel, the Vane estate. It was a masterpiece of cold, modern architecture, surrounded by a 10-foot perimeter wall, and guards who moved with the synchronized grace of professional soldiers. This was the seat of Silas Vane's empire, a man rumored to control every shipping lane and shadow alley in the country. As Elena was led through the halls, she felt the oppressive weight of wealth without warmth. The floors were white marble, polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights. There were no family photos on the walls, no stray toys, no signs of the child who owned the shredded sketchbook. It felt like a mausoleum for the living. Every door they passed was reinforced, and every camera lens seemed to track her movements with predatory intent. She clutched her wooden toolbox, filled with bone folders, wheat starch, and fine brushes, as if it were a shield. She was a lamb entering the lair of a wolf, and she knew that in this house, impossible was a dangerous word to utter. The king of shadows. The double doors of the study swung open, revealing a room that smelled of expensive bourbon and old tobacco. Silas Vane stood by a window, his back to the room. He was a silhouette of raw power, his shoulders broad and his stance rigid. When he turned, Elena felt the air leave her lungs. He was strikingly handsome in a lethal way, eyes the color of a winter sea and a jawline that could have been carved from flint. But it was the coldness in his gaze that struck her. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to feel. "You're the one," Silas said, his voice a low, melodic growl. He didn't offer a hand or a seat. He simply pointed at the briefcase Marcus had set down. "That book is the only thing my son, Toby, cares about. He hasn't spoken a word in 14 months. Not since his mother's funeral. Last night he destroyed it. If you can't fix it, he loses his only connection to the world." Elena looked at the man who held the city in his grip. He looked desperate, though he hid it behind a mass of iron. "Books are like people, Mr. Vane," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "If you break them too badly, they don't just fix. They have to be rebuilt, and it takes time. The cry in the dark, before Silas could respond, a piercing, jagged wail echoed from the floor above. It wasn't the sound of a child having a tantrum. It was the sound of a soul being torn apart. It was a high, thin scream that ended in a choked sob, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy crashing against a wall. Silas's mask slipped for a heartbeat, a flash of agony crossing his features before he regained his composure. "That's Toby," Silas said, his voice tight. "The doctors say he's unreachable. They want to send him to a facility in Switzerland. They say he's a danger to himself." Elena felt a familiar ache in her chest. She knew that scream. She had made that sound herself in the years following the fire, when the silence of the world felt like it was crushing her lungs. "He's not unreachable," Elena said, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce protectiveness. "He's just trapped in the ruins of what he lost. You can't fix a child with doctors and facilities any more than you can fix a book by throwing it away." Silas looked at her then, really looked at her, noticing the way she held her toolkit, like a lifeline. "Go to him," he commanded. "But be careful. He doesn't like to be touched." The room of shattered dreams. The guards led Elena to a room at the end of a long, dark hallway. When the door opened, she stepped into a disaster zone. The walls had been stripped of wallpaper in patches, and a $2,000 lamp lay shattered in the corner. In the center of the room, huddled under a heavy oak desk, was Toby. He was small for 7, with his father's dark hair and eyes that looked far too old for his face. He was clutching a single scrap of the sketchbook, a fragment showing the corner of a drawn sun. Elena didn't approach him. She didn't offer platitudes or try to coax him out with sweets. Instead, she sat down on the floor 5 feet away from the desk and opened her toolkit. She cleared a small space on the hardwood floor and laid out her materials: the small jars of paste, the fine silk tissue, and the surgical scalpels. She began to sort through the confetti from the briefcase, her movements slow and rhythmic. She ignored the boy, focusing entirely on the task of aligning 2 jagged edges of a drawing. She was showing him, through silence, that she was a guest in his chaos, not an invader, the silent observer. For 3 hours, Elena worked in total silence. She didn't look at Toby, but she could feel his eyes on her. The boy had stopped crying and was now watching her hands with a clinical intensity. He noticed the way she used a tiny brush to apply the wheat starch paste, her touch so light it barely disturbed the paper. He watched as she used a bone folder to smooth out a crease, her movements as steady as a surgeon's. Under the desk, Toby shifted. He was curious. No one had ever come into his room and just worked. Usually, they talked at him, pleaded with him, or tried to force him into educational play. Elena was different. She was a craftsman, and her labor was a form of meditation. By the time the sun began to set, casting long, orange shadows across the room, Elena had managed to reconstruct half of 1 page. It was a drawing of a garden. She left it on the floor, packed her tools, and stood up. As she reached the door, she heard a soft rustle of movement. She didn't turn back, but she knew Toby had crawled out to look at the mended page. The master's curiosity. Downstairs, Silas was waiting for her in the dining hall. A feast was laid out: prime rib, roasted vegetables, and vintage wine, but he hadn't touched a bite. He watched Elena enter, his eyes scanning her for signs of injury. "Well," he asked, his voice echoing in the vast space. "He's watching me," Elena said, taking a seat at the far end of the table. She felt out of place among the silver and crystal. "He doesn't need a therapist, Silas. He needs to see that things can be put back together. He needs to see the process of healing." Silas leaned back, his gaze lingering on the high collar of her blouse. He was a man who dealt in certainties, in force and leverage. The idea of healing through paper and paste was foreign to him. "You call me by my first name," he noted, his voice dropping an octave. "Most people here call me Sir or Mr. Vane. Why are you different?" Elena met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "Because I'm not afraid of your money, and I'm not impressed by your power. I'm here for Toby. To me, you're just a man who let his son's heart break." A heavy silence fell over the room, but Silas didn't roar. He simply watched her, a spark of something, curiosity, perhaps flickering in his cold eyes. The first bridge. On the third day, the breakthrough happened. Elena was working on a particularly difficult section of the sketchbook, a portrait of a woman with a kind smile. As she reached for her scalpel, a small, pale hand reached out from the shadows and pushed a missing scrap of paper toward her. It was a woman's eye. Elena didn't gasp. She didn't look up and startle him. She simply picked up the scrap, whispered, "Thank you, Toby," and glued it into place. The boy sat down beside her, his shoulder inches from hers. He smelled of soap and a lingering, heavy sadness. For the rest of the afternoon, they worked together in a rhythmic dance. Toby would find a piece, and Elena would fix it. They were two people who had forgotten how to speak, communicating through the reconstruction of a memory. From the doorway, Silas watched them. He saw his son, the boy he thought he had lost forever, engaged and calm. He also saw Elena. The light from the window caught the side of her neck, revealing a glimpse of the scar she tried so hard to hide. He realized then that she wasn't just a librarian. She was a survivor who had walked through the fire and come out with hands that could mend the world. The scar revealed that evening, as Elena was leaving, she tripped on a loose rug in the hallway. Her toolkit spilled, and as she reached down to gather her brushes, her collar snagged on the corner of a marble pedestal. The top button popped, and the fabric fell away, exposing the full extent of the burn scar on her shoulder and neck. It was a map of pain, jagged, red, and permanent. Silas was right there. He reached out to help her, his hand stopping just inches from the scarred skin. Elena froze, her breath catching in her throat. She expected pity, or perhaps the look of revulsion she had seen on so many others. Instead, Silas's expression was one of profound, dark recognition. He reached out and gently brushed his thumb against the edge of the scar. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Elena pulled away, clutching her blouse together. "The past did, Mr. Vane, the same way it did to Toby. The only difference is I've had more time to learn how to hide the damage." She hurried away, leaving Silas standing in the hall, his heart beating with protective fury he hadn't felt in years. The shadow in the garden. A week into her stay, Elena convinced Silas to let Toby go outside. They sat in the walled rose garden, the air thick with the scent of blooming petals. Elena brought her work outside, and Toby sat beside her, playing with a set of wooden blocks. For a moment, it felt like a normal life, but the peace was shattered when a red appeared on Toby's chest. Elena's instincts, honed by years of hypervigilance, screamed. "Toby, down!" she yelled, lunging across the grass. She tackled the boy just as a bullet hissed through the air, shattering a stone bird bath exactly where Toby's head had been a second before. Elena didn't scream. She rolled with the boy, shielding his body with hers, and crawled toward the shelter of a thick stone wall. The guards were already moving, their black SUVs roaring to life. But Elena's focus was entirely on the trembling child in her arms. "I've got you," she whispered into his hair. "I've got you, and I'm not letting go." The Iron King's wrath. The aftermath of the assassination attempt was a whirlwind of violence and steel. Silas arrived in the garden like a god of war, his face a mask of pure, murderous intent. He found Elena and Toby behind the wall. Elena was covered in dirt, her blouse torn, but she was holding Toby with a grip that wouldn't break. The boy wasn't screaming. He was tucked into Elena's chest, hiding his face in her neck. Silas knelt beside them, his hands shaking, a sight his men had never seen. He checked Toby for injuries, then turned his gaze to Elena. "You're bleeding," he said, noticing a graze on her arm from a stone shard. "I'm fine," she snapped, her eyes burning with adrenaline. "Just get him inside. Now!" That night, the city felt the weight of Silas Vane's anger. While he sent his men to hunt the snipers, he stayed in the nursery. He watched as Elena sat on Toby's bed, reading to him until he fell into a fitful sleep. He realized that his fortress had failed, but this woman, this poor librarian, had been the only true defense his son had. The debt collector. While Silas dealt with his enemies, Elena's own past decided to resurface. A man named Miller, a low-level thug from her old neighborhood who knew the truth about the fire that killed her family, had tracked her to the Vane estate. He didn't want Silas's money. He wanted Elena to steal a digital key from Silas's office. He intercepted her at the library when she went to pick up more supplies. "You look good in silk, Elena," Miller sneered, pinning her against the stacks. "Does the boss know you're the reason your parents didn't make out of that house? Does he know you tripped over your own feet while the kitchen burned?" Elena felt the old coldness seeping into her bones. "Leave me alone, Miller. I have nothing for you." "You have access," he countered. "Get me the key, or I tell Vane exactly what kind of heroin he has in his house. I'll tell him you're a curse." Elena pushed past him, her heart heavy. She knew that in Silas's world, a mistake was often worse than crime. The Office of Secrets. Elena returned to the estate, her mind a whirlwind of fear. She found herself standing outside Silas's private office late at night. The door was ajar. She could see the digital key sitting on his desk, a small, innocuous-looking USB drive that held the codes to his shipping empire. She thought about Miller's threat. If Silas knew the truth, that she had been the one to leave the stove on, that her clumsiness had caused a fire, he would surely throw her out. She stepped into the room, her hand reaching for the drive, but then she saw a photo on the desk. It wasn't Silas's late wife. It was a candid shot of her and Toby in the garden, taken from a distance. In the photo, she was smiling, and Toby was looking up at her with a look of pure trust. She pulled her hand back, as if the desk were on fire. She couldn't do it. She would rather be destroyed by her past than betray the first home she had felt in a decade. The confession. Looking for something? Silas's voice came from the shadows of the corner. He was sitting in a high-backed chair, a glass of scotch in his hand. Elena jumped, her heart nearly stopping. I was, she admitted, her voice trembling. She walked over and sat in the chair opposite him. "There's a man, Miller. He knows about the fire. He's blackmailing me." She told him everything. She told him about the night of the fire, the guilt that had eaten her alive for 10 years, and the scar that was her penance. She expected him to call the guards. She expected him to look at her with the same disgust she felt for herself. Instead, Silas stood up, walked over to her, and pulled her to her feet. "Elena," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I've spent my life surrounded by people who do bad things for profit. You did a human thing. You survived. And as for Miller, he's already been handled. No one threatens what belongs to me." The "what belongs to me," the phrase "what belongs to me," hung in the air between them, heavy and electric. Elena looked up at him, her breath hitching. "I don't belong to anyone, Silas," she whispered, though her body was leaning toward him. Silas didn't pull away. He reached out and cupped her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "In this house you do," he said. "Not as a servant, and not as an employee. You are the heartbeat of this place. Elena, since you arrived, the ghosts have stopped screaming. My son is coming back to me. And I—" He stopped, the Iron King struggling for words. "I am starting to remember what it feels like to be a man instead of a weapon." He kissed her then, a kiss that was desperate, protective, and filled with a decade of suppressed longing. For the first time, Elena didn't feel like a ghost. She felt like a woman. The first W. The next morning, the house was transformed. Toby was sitting at the breakfast table, drawing in his now fully restored sketchbook. Silas was actually sitting with him, drinking coffee and reading the paper instead of taking calls in his office. Elena walked in, and Toby looked up. He pointed at a drawing of a small, mended bird he had made. "Blue," Toby said. The silence that followed was deafening. Silas froze, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. Elena felt tears pricking her eyes. It was just one word, but it was a bridge across a canyon of grief. Toby looked at Elena, a small, shy smile touching his lips. "Blue bird, Elena." Silas set his cup down, his hands shaking. He reached across the table and took Toby's hand, then reached out his other hand for Elena's. In that moment, the mafia boss was gone. There was only a father, a son, and the woman who had brought them back to life. The rivals move. The peace was short-lived. Silas's rivals, the Moretti family, saw his newfound softness as a weakness. They launched a series of attacks on his shipping docks, try to draw him out into a turf war. Silas grew distant again, his eyes returning to the color of winter ice. He spent his nights in the war room, planning his retaliation. Elena saw the change and hated it. She went to his office, slamming a book down on his desk to get his attention. "You're slipping back, Silas," she challenged. "You're becoming the monster they want you to be. If you go down this path, you'll lose everything we built with Toby." Silas looked at her, his face weary. "I have to protect us, Elena. The only language these men speak is blood." "Then speak it," she said, leaning over the desk. "But don't let it become your only language. Don't let them take the man you become." The Gala of Glass. To settle the dispute without a full-scale war, a neutral party called for a gala, a gathering of the city's most powerful and dangerous families. Silas was expected to attend to show his strength. He asked Elena to go with him. "I need you by my side," he said. "You're my anchor." Elena agreed, but she didn't wear the high-collared blouses of her past. She chose a gown of midnight blue silk, with a plunging back that left her scars visible for everyone to see. She was no longer hiding. When they walked into the ballroom, the whispers stopped. Silas looked like a king, but Elena looked like a queen who had survived a fire and lived to tell the tale. The Morettis watched them from across the room, realizing that Silas Vane hadn't become weak. He had become invincible because he finally had something worth fighting for. The trap sprung. The gala was a setup. As the clock struck midnight, the lights went out, and a group of mercenaries hired by the Morettis stormed the room. Chaos erupted. Silas drew his weapon, his first instinct to pull Elena behind him. But Elena wasn't the helpless librarian they expected. She had memorized the layout of the building, an old historical estate she had studied years ago. "The service tunnels," she shouted over the gunfire. "Silas, this way." She led him through a hidden door behind a tapestry, navigating the dark, damp passages with a confidence that stunned him. She knew these old buildings like the back of her hand. She led him out to the gardens, where his extraction team was waiting. She hadn't just been saved. She had been the one to save the king. The aftermath of fire. Back at the estate, Silas was silent as Elena tended to a small cut on his forehead. The house was on high alert, but inside the library it was quiet. Silas looked at her, his eyes dark with a mix of awe and terror. "You could have been killed," he said. "You should have stayed in the tunnels." "And let you face them alone?" Elena countered, her hand steady as she applied the bandage. "I told you, Silas. I'm not a ghost anymore. I'm here and I'm part of this." Silas pulled her into his lap, burying his face in her neck. "I've spent my life building walls to keep people out, but you just walked right through them." He realized that his power didn't come from his guns or his money. It came from a woman who wasn't afraid to see him bleed. The lesson of the bone folder. The next few weeks were a lesson in balance. Silas continued to run his empire, but he did it with a surgical precision that avoided unnecessary bloodshed. He began to consult Elena on restoration, not of books, but of his public image in his business dealings. She showed him that sometimes the best way to fix a problem wasn't to tear it down, but to carefully realign the pieces. Toby, meanwhile, was thriving. He was talking in full sentences now, his laughter a frequent sound in the once silent halls. He began to learn the art of book restoration from Elena, his small hands surprisingly adept at the delicate work. One afternoon, Silas joined him on the floor, picking up a bone folder and trying to smooth a page. He was clumsy and frustrated, but Elena just laughed and guided his hand. They were a family, forged in the heat of conflict and mended by the patience of a librarian. The final threat, the Morettis, desperate and losing ground, made one final cowardly move. They didn't attack Silas or Elena. They targeted Toby's school bus. Elena was the one who got the call. She didn't wait for Silas's men. She grabbed her heavy toolkit, jumped into her old battered car, and raced toward the highway. She found the bus forced off the road, 2 black SUVs surrounding it. The men were trying to pry the door open. Elena didn't hesitate. She drove her car directly into the side of the lead SUV, the impact deployment of her airbags barely dazing her. She stumbled out, her toolkit in hand. She didn't have a gun, but she had a flare gun she kept for emergencies and a heavy metal mallet used for setting book spines. The librarian stand. Elena fired the flare into the air, signaling the estate security, then stood in front of the bus door. The mercenaries laughed at the sight of the small, disheveled woman. "Get out of the way, lady," one of them growled, raising his weapon. "No," Elena said, her voice ringing with a power that made them pause. "You want the boy? You have to go through me, and I've already survived a fire. You don't scare me." She used a mallet to shatter the kneecap of the first man who approached, her movements a blur of desperate, protective rage. She was a whirlwind of silk and steel, defending her masterpiece until the roar of Silas's helicopter filled the air. The humbling. When Silas jumped from the helicopter, he found the scene already under control. Elena was sitting on the ground, Toby clutched in her lap, surrounded by 3 unconscious mercenaries. She was covered in grease and blood, but her eyes were clear. Silas fell to his knees beside her, his chest heaving. "You did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved him again." Elena looked up at him, a tired smile on her face. "I told you, Silas. Anything can be mended if you're willing to sit in the dark with it." Silas realized that he would never be the most powerful person in this relationship. He was a sword, but she was the hand that guided it. The cleansing. The Moretti family was dismantled within 48 hours. But this time, Silas did it through the law, using the evidence Elena had helped him gather from his shipping manifests. He turned himself in for the minor crimes, paying his debt to the city and purging his organization of the shadow elements. He wanted to be a man Toby could look up to without shame. While Silas was in a minimum security facility for 6 months, Elena ran the foundation they had started together, the Mending House. It was a center for traumatized children, using art and book restoration to help them find their voices. She visited Silas every day, bringing him books that needed healing. They talked about the future, about a life where they didn't have to look over their shoulders. The proposal in the stacks. The day Silas was released, he didn't go to his office. He went to the basement of the Oak Haven Public Library. He found Elena exactly where he had first seen her, at her workbench, the scent of jasmine tea in the air. He didn't bring his guards. He didn't bring his wealth. He brought a single ancient book, a first edition of Jane Eyre. He opened the book to the middle, where he had hidden a ring. It wasn't a diamond. It was a simple band of gold, engraved with the pattern of a mended page. "Elena," he said, his voice trembling, "I'm a man with a lot of scars. Some you can see, and some you can't. Will you help me restore the rest of my life?" Elena didn't say a word. She simply reached out, took the ring, and pulled him into a kiss that tasted like home. The wedding of scars. They were married in the rose garden of this state. It wasn't a gala. It was a gathering of people who had seen the worst of the world and chosen to stay kind. Toby was a ring bearer. His voice loud and clear as he announced, "I love my mummy." The proposal in the stacks. The day Silas was released, he didn't go to his office. He went to the basement of the Oak Haven Public Library. He found Elena exactly where he had first seen her, at her workbench, the scent of jasmine tea in the air. He didn't bring his guards. He didn't bring his wealth. He brought a single ancient book, a first edition of Jane Eyre. He opened the book to the middle, where he had hidden a ring. It wasn't a diamond. It was a simple band of gold, engraved with the pattern of a mended page. "Elena," he said, his voice trembling, "I'm a man with a lot of scars. Some you can see, and some you can't. Will you help me restore the rest of my life?" Elena didn't say a word. She simply reached out, took the ring, and pulled him into a kiss that tasted like home. The wedding of scars. They were married in the rose garden of the estate. It wasn't a gala. It was a gathering of people who had seen the worst of the world and chosen to stay kind. Toby was a ring bearer. His voice loud and clear as he announced, "I love my mummy." Elena wore a dress that showed every inch of the scar on her neck. Beside her, Silas wore a suit that couldn't hide the hardness of his past, but his eyes were filled with a light that had been missing for years. They didn't exchange vows about perfection. They exchanged vows about restoration, about the beauty of the broken and the strength of the mended, the new masterpiece. A year later, the Vane estate was no longer a fortress. The black glass had been replaced with warm, inviting windows, and the garden was filled with the sound of children laughing. Elera's foundation had become a global success, and Silas was a respected leader in the city's redevelopment. Toby was a thriving 8-year-old, a protector of his new baby sister, Clara. The mercenary's son was now just a boy who loved books and basketball. They often sat together in the library, Silas, Elena, and Toby, working on their own projects. The silence in the house was no longer the silence of grief. It was the silence of peace, the eternal archive. As Elena sat at her workbench, looking at a photo of her family, she realized that her life was her greatest work of restoration. She had taken the shredded remnants of her heart and, with the help of a dangerous man and a broken boy, she had built a masterpiece. She looked at the scar on her neck in the mirror and smiled. It wasn't a mark of shame. It was a mark of survival. She knew that the world would always have fires, and the world would always have people who tried to tear things apart. But she also knew that as long as there was glue, patience, and a little bit of love, nothing was ever truly lost. The poor librarian had done the impossible. She had mended the Iron King.